Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
Throughout much of the summer, and even here as we get into the fall, we're going to be talking a fair bit about drought. We've talked about prairie drought much of the summer, but here as we transition, we're going to be talking about another drought here in North America, and quite frankly, it is a drought that in some respects is more severe and more concerning, and that is going to be the drought that is affecting the Pacific Flyway, pretty much everything west of the Rocky Mountains. Today is going to be the first of a series of new episodes on this. We have had some episodes from the previous season where we referenced some of the issues that were occurring in the western U.S. related to waterfowl and waterfowl habitats and how they kind of intersect with some water issues there. And so we have another 3 episodes coming up that are going to be further expanding on this discussion. And today is the first of those. So it's a big picture view of the Western Drought. And to help me with this conversation, I'm happy to welcome in 2 guests here from out in our Western region. Jeff McCreary, our Director of Operations for the Western region. Jeff, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us, Mike.
And Dr. Mark Petrie, the Director of Conservation Planning for the Western region.
Thanks, Mike.
Now, Mark, you have been on the podcast once or twice before, talking about different topics. Jeff, this is your first time joining us here, so I'm going to give you an opportunity to give a bit more expanded background on your personal and professional career and what it is that you do for Ducks Unlimited these days.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It's great to be on here. And I've been with DU for over 22 years now, going on my 23rd year. I'm currently the Director of Operations for Ducks Unlimited's Western region, overseeing our conservation programs in the 9 Western states. I've been doing a variety of jobs with DU over the years, a regional biologist in Utah and Idaho, Arizona, Nevada. Moved back to California, my home state, to work in the Bay Area and the Sacramento, San Joaquin Delta. And just really fortunate enough now to be able to be on a fantastic team of amazing conservationists out here in the West, doing hard to make a difference for the ducks in the Pacific Flyway. And
Mark, like I said, you've been on a couple of times, so frequent listeners will have heard your voice, heard your expertise, and have heard some of your background before. But for folks that may be tuning in for the first time, give us a brief background on where you come from and what you do for Ducks Unlimited.
Sure, Mike. Like Jeff, I've been with Ducks Unlimited for over 20 years. Most of that time has been in the Western region, serving as the Director of Conservation Planning. Most of that job involves kind of figuring out maybe where we need to be working, how much work we need to be doing in those areas, that kind of thing. The science behind some of our programs. Did spend 4 or 5 years at National before I came out to the West here and enjoyed my time there as well.
Well, we appreciate both of you taking the time to join us here. As I introduced at the outset, we have drought in the year 2021 has been something that has occupied much of our time within the organization. And it's sort of interesting how much of the summer our focus was on the prairie drought because of its logical intersection with implications for breeding waterfowl populations. And now as we enter the fall, although the drought that we're going to talk about here today has been in place for quite some time, it's right now and into the following months that we're going to really see some of the additional implications and potentially more severe implications of the situation out there. And so in this series of episodes that we'll follow with some different guests, we're going to touch on different aspects of this. Today, we're going to provide a sort of high-level view of the scope of the drought, the severity of the drought, what its implications are for wetlands and for waterfowl as well as waterfowl hunters. And you 2 guys and the jobs that you're in, you bring that big picture perspective to us because you work across that entire region. We're going to be speaking with some of your colleagues here a bit later on about some of the specifics of a few key regions, the Central Valley of California and the Klamath Basin. So we're today introducing the drought, how widespread it is, severe it is. And so we're just going to jump right in here. And Jeff, in your position, I want you to talk about, introduce this to us. Like I said, it's been on your plate much of the summer. So tell us, how can you summarize the scope and scale and severity of this drought?
Well, Mike, I'm looking at the U.S. Drought Monitor map, and this is a map that USDA and NOAA and some educational institutions put out together, and they update this every week. And for the week of August 17th, I'm looking at the map, and it is exceptional drought in all of the key waterfowl landscapes in the Western United States. And, for those of us out West, we realize that those important waterfowl landscapes are the low areas. We're surrounded by mountains and desert and forests, and waterfowl are in those valley bottoms and the river bottoms and the lakes. And that's exactly where the exceptional drought, which is the most extreme condition of drought that the government assigns, and that's the Great Salt Lake, that's the Central Valley of California, that's the Klamath Basin and Northeast California, Southern Oregon, it's the Columbia Basin in Eastern Washington. All of these areas are seeing the lowest water levels, some of the lowest precipitation levels, annual precipitation levels on record. The Great Salt Lake, for example, has exceeded already this year its historic low from the 1960s. The Klamath Basin is seeing Tule Lake dry, perhaps for the first time ever, but certainly for the first time in recorded history. Tule Lake Sump 1A is bone dry. The Central Valley, we're seeing historic lows in water supplies in our major reservoirs. The first time that power has been shut off, or at least the first time in decades that the power has been shut off at Lake Oroville, which supplies a lot of the water for managed wetlands and winter flooded rice in the Central Valley. Folsom Lake, Shasta, all of those are in extreme low conditions. And these are the places where the birds come in the fall migration. These are places where they're going to overwinter. These are places where they're going to return to in the spring. And it's uncertain about what that's going to look like at that point. But we know for certain that there's going to be much reduced habitat available in all of these landscapes for birds during this fall migration and over the winter.
Are there any areas, I'm looking at the map, or a map similar to, if not the exact same map that you are, and yeah, as I said at the outset, pretty much everything west of the Rockies is in some level of drought, and looks to be over 50% is in extreme or exceptional drought. Are there any areas within your region, the Western region, that are important for waterfowl that may have been spared the drought that we're looking at right now?
Yeah, one of the few places in almost the entire Western United States, the entire half of the country, is the Puget Sound area. And that is just in the lowest stage of drought. It's called abnormally dry, but it's the step above no drought. And that is actually a really important landscape for birds. And I would imagine that it's going to continue to be so this year. It's in the Puget Sound, the agricultural landscape in and around the sound is vitally important for migrating birds, the North Puget Sound most particularly. But that's just a very small landscape within the Pacific Flyway. And while birds will stage there and will overwinter there, it's certainly not enough to support the rest of the Flyway.
Mark, I have a question for you now. The Western U.S. is desert or arid in most of the cases, except for some of those coastal regions and of course, the Pacific Northwest. But much of this landscape, I think, is probably appropriately classified as semi-arid or somewhere along that gradient. So I guess the point is that water shortages or water limitations is not something that's necessarily new or foreign to this region, and it's something that we as Ducks Unlimited and wetland managers out there have had to contend with ever since we've been operating and trying to manage wetlands in that landscape. But you having been there for the length of time that you have, does this feel different? And in terms of its severity, and what kind of stories can you share relative to the severity in that regard?
Well, certainly, Mike, we've had drought here in the past. Just 4 or 5 years ago, the Central Valley was in the grips of a pretty serious drought. But what distinguishes this year is essentially all of our, or most of our important waterfowl areas, migration and wintering areas in the Pacific Flyway are in that category of exceptional drought that you and Jeff are just discussing. So that's what makes this year unique from a waterfowl perspective, is that so much of the Pacific Flyway are in those extreme drought conditions. So, yet, yes, to your question, we always have concerns over water every year, but those are particularly magnified on a very broad scale this year.
Now, outside of the Central Valley, and maybe, I guess, to at least to some extent within the Central Valley, the water that we derive in those landscapes is going to be predominantly, or at least some significant fraction, from snowmelt, right, Mark?
Yes, in fact, that's true, Mike. Really, that's really true of all our major waterfowl habitats, or most of our major waterfowl habitats in those kind of semi-arid landscapes that you mentioned. That they ultimately rely for a big chunk of their surface water deliveries from that snowpack, which we know in many cases has really been declining for a number of years now.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go with that. Is sort of how long has this been? Has this been in emergence, or has been in development? Because if we contrast it with the prairies, if we think back to last year, North Dakota and South Dakota were almost overflowing with abundant wetlands and very good wetland conditions. And then now it's this year, 2021, is a complete 180. So the drought that we're seeing in the Dakotas happened over the course of 365 days, give or take. But what we're seeing out west has, I think it's fair, based on some of what we talked about last year, this has sort of been underway for a bit longer. Is that a fair assessment, Mark?
Yeah, it is, Mike. There are a lot of things that have been happening that are kind of chronic in nature, and they're just made worse, and they're more exposed by the drought conditions we have now. We have really about 70% of our waterfowl in the Pacific Flyway spend or occur in really just three landscapes, if you will, between, say, September and April. And that, of course, is the Central Valley, it's the Klamath Basin, and the Great Salt Lake. And all three of those landscapes have serious long-term water issues that have been with us for a while, and in some cases have progressively gotten worse over time. And of course, this year just is much worse because of the lack of water. Really exposes a lot of those challenges that really are challenges almost on an annual basis. But they're particularly challenging in the kind of year we're having now.
Much of our conversation, or at least a fair portion of our conversation as we go forward here, is going to be about the effects of the drought on resources, wetland resources for waterfowl during fall and winter. But Jeff, I want to talk about breeding ducks first, because the Intermountain West, California, Oregon, Washington, all produce ducks year in and year out. So we're not just talking about implications and consequences from a non-breeding waterfowl standpoint. This impacts our waterfowl production in that region. Also, what can you tell us and tell our listeners about any insights on how this has affected productivity of ducks out west this year?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's important for people to know that, and for duck hunters to know that a lot of times these birds that we're seeing, they didn't come from Alaska, or they didn't come from Canada. They came from eastern Washington. They came from the Great Salt Lake. They came from eastern Nevada. They came from northeast California, or the Central Valley of California. And in fact, more than 60% of the mallards that are shot during the duck season in California were born and raised in California. These drought areas, the three places that Mark mentioned, I mentioned the Columbia Basin in eastern Washington, the Panhandle of northern Idaho. We can throw that in there too. These are all important waterfowl production areas in the lower 48, and they're all in exceptional drought, the highest category of drought. It's going to be hard to know exactly what the effect on breeding birds was until a little bit later on, and we see kind of what the numbers have been. But you can only imagine that it had to have some effect. And I think, another important aspect of waterfowl life history is overlooked, and that's the molt migration that all of these birds sometimes take. And the birds that are breeding in the lower 48 make a short migration, a relatively short migration to large bodies of water with large stands of wetland habitat. If you've ever been to the Klamath Basin, you've seen these massive wetlands that have a lot of open water, lots of cover. Those are perfect for molting birds. And in August, ducks go through a molt, so they lose their feathers. And for waterfowl, this time of year, they lose their flight feathers as well. So they're trapped. They can't fly anywhere. And that's exactly why banding occurs in August, is because it's easy to catch these birds because they can't fly. They can be corralled and they can be captured to put a band on them. But these same habitats are what's important for the molt migration. So not only are they important for breeding, but they're also important for molting. And that is a critical component for them. That's a lot of energy that it takes to regrow those feathers. And when there's fewer of those wetlands available, there's more ducks pulling off more of the resources of these wetlands. So we're a little concerned about what the body condition of these birds are going to be after they come out of their molt and come back down to the wintering ground.
Jeff, it makes my brain hurt a little bit to think about all the different aspects of the life cycle, the annual cycle of waterfowl that the drought that we're seeing out west is really going to affect, and knowing how it's going to affect it, and then what are the carryover to next year. Going back to kind of the breeding waterfowl question, I don't know, Mark, I'll ask you this question. You can add anything else to this that you want to, but this is 2021. We have struggled across North America with conducting breeding population surveys, and I know there are some states out west that typically conduct those surveys. I don't know if we have any data to draw on there to speak to, it's to speak to how it may have affected some of what we're seeing in terms of the distribution of breeding ducks. So we can't, we don't have that data. I don't know what it would show, but are you hearing anything, Mark, related to the lack of surveys, or would that have given us any insights or anything else related to effects on breeding ducks out there?
Well, Mike, you're right. Because of the lack of surveys that have happened this year, it's we're forced to speculate more than we otherwise would. Although I think we probably can draw some conclusions or make some predictions. From a Pacific Flyway hunter standpoint, we get birds from several areas. Alaska and the boreal forest, the western boreal forest, are traditionally very important, as is southern Alberta. And then as we move south, we get into these more local populations, birds that are breeding in the Central Valley, birds that are breeding in Oregon, birds that are breeding in Washington. But we are able to stitch together maybe a little bit of a picture for the coming year. In fact, I just received the survey results for Alaska, which has become progressively more important to Pacific Flyway hunters over the years. Alaska looks pretty good. I haven't had a chance to summarize all the numbers, but at least for mallards are up in Alaska this year a bit. I've heard some, decent reports about the western boreal forest. So that's kind of on the good news side, if you will. And again, both of those landscapes, they're big landscapes, they're generally protected from drought. And so I think they're going to maybe soften the blow a little bit for us. As we move south, though, the news gets progressively worse. Southern Alberta in generally is very dry. We shouldn't expect to see much production coming out of Alberta. And that'll be reflected, of course, in the number of birds we see, because Alberta is traditionally very important. British Columbia, my guess is production will be down there as well, because the interior British Columbia is dry. As we go into Oregon and Washington, I've had conversations with state waterfowl biologists in both of those states, and they are of the opinion that although there were maybe below normal numbers of breeding birds in those landscapes, maybe not too far below average, they just simply don't expect much production out of those landscapes this year because of the drought. And certainly the same is true, or even more true, for the Central Valley of California, where mallard production there, as Jeff noted, is obviously local mallard production is very important to hunters in California. But again, the conditions in the Central Valley this year in Northern California just aren't conducive to good production. They just aren't. So some good news in the more northern areas for Pacific Flyway hunters, but those southern areas that typically provide us with birds, we shouldn't expect a lot out of this year.
As waterfowl hunters and those that that are just passionate about waterfowl and want to know what the birds are going to do every single year. We always wish we had a crystal ball that could look out at least 3 months, but typically farther than that. And so that's kind of where we have found ourselves mentally over the past 6 months or so. And now we're where we think about what are the implications of this for breeding ducks? What are the implications of breeding ducks within the region affected by the drought? What are the implications for the birds that are going to be molting in that region? And now we kind of transition to thinking about what are the implications of this for the birds that are going to be winging their way south? And Mark, as you noted, those birds come from multiple locations. So we have to think about that as well in the context of, what it means. What are these locally produced birds as well as northerly produced birds that will migrate into the area going to encounter as they arrive? So this is where it gets tricky in terms of describing what's going on and what's going to happen. But Jeff, give it your best shot for those people that may not be as familiar with some of those landscapes. What do those wetlands out there look like right now? We can, and you can compartmentalize between some of the riceland landscapes as well as some of the natural wetlands. And what's that wetland base looking at? And then Mark, I'll come to you to talk about some of the bioenergetic aspects of it from a food resource standpoint.
Sure. It is a challenging thing because it does rely on getting down to a specific acre in some cases. And let me start on the east and kind of work my way west. And in the Great Salt Lake, typically waterfowl use the managed wetlands on the fringes and the edges, the upper that transition between the lake and kind of the more upland urban areas around Great Salt Lake. And those wetlands will likely have, some of those wetlands will likely have decent water. On the South Shore, the clubs down there, I think have decent water. The Bear River produces about 60% of the inflows to the Great Salt Lake. And I would imagine that is going to be severely limited. So I would imagine that the Bear River Refuge would be fairly dry. And the birds move between the lake itself and these managed wetlands. Sometimes they're resting out on the lake when the lake's high and conditions are good. They can actually be feeding out there on some brine shrimp. In fact, the largest wintering population of goldeneye hang out on the lake itself. But the lake is at historic lows. So I would imagine that birds are going to be hanging out more in those managed wetlands because there's not really any other place to go besides a hypersaline lake. When we move to the Klamath Basin, it's dry. The Lower Klamath National Wildlife Refuge may not have any water during this fall. At Tule Lake, Sump 1A, a 9,000 acre unit, is completely dry. The Sump 1B will actually have some water in it. How much of that is going to be huntable is up to the refuge still. And I would imagine there will be some upland dry field hunting that's going to be available, but maybe limited because not a lot of that was irrigated this year. And then finally, when we get over to the Central Valley, there will be wetlands out there. There will be wetlands on some of the privately managed wetlands. There'll be wetlands available and with water on them on some public ground. A lot of that water is because there's some stored water that's legally mandated to go to these areas within it's stored in the reservoirs that all indications indicate that these specific wetlands will get their water, their surface water. Other wetlands are going to have to rely on groundwater, and most of the rice that's going to be flooded this year will also have to be reliant upon groundwater pumping. So we're envisioning a landscape that has maybe 25% of the rice acres that could be flooded in the winter will have water for decomposition and duck hunting. So you may have a rice blind that is going to be dry this year, or you may get lucky and your farmer has a well and he's going to be flooding that rice. From a public standpoint, there's groundwater is going to be a lot less water than there would be out there with surface water. So areas like Gray Lodge, they've got wells, and there will be some wetland habitat that's out there. How those units are distributed and how they're managed for public hunting, that's going to be a decision that the Department of Fish and Wildlife will have to make. Grasslands, a lot of the clubs down there will have and some of the wildlife areas get that legally mandated water that's stored in those reservoirs. How much of that and when they get it, I think, is still up in the air. They may get some water early, but will that water last throughout the season if we don't get rain? So it's going to be a little variable, last minute decisions, I think, about when a lot of these areas decide to take that winter water that's stored, because it's a calculation based on if they take it early and provide habitat for birds, there may not be enough water to last through the season. They take it later, there's not going to be habitat available for those early migrants, but there may be water that lasts through the season. So there's a lot of uncertainty right now about what it's actually going to look like on the landscape.
That was an exceptional summary and synopsis there, Jeff. Appreciate that. And Mark, I want to now throw you a question that should be right in your wheelhouse. For much of your career, you have been involved in one way or another in studying the bioenergetic modeling, which is the basis for a lot of the conservation planning that we at Ducks Unlimited and a lot of our partners do, and trying to figure out how much habitat and what kind of habitats do we need to be providing across these important landscapes to support our target populations of waterfowl, ducks and geese included. You have studied this extensively throughout the Western U.S. There is no one more knowledgeable of this subject than you, and it almost feels like you have been preparing for this day for many years to give us, with all the modeling that you have done, all of the studying of waterfowl habitats and food resources that you've done, trying to figure out what the consequences of various levels of drought are for waterfowl across this interconnected Western U.S. landscape. So give us, you're probably not going to be able to tell us, well, this is exactly how much habitat we're going to have out there, how much less than we would have than normal. But I know you've run some scenarios. Give us your best assessment as the way you've thought about this in terms of what we're likely to see, food resources across these landscapes, how much less than let's say average or typical, and what are the potential implications for waterfowl.
Mike, if I didn't know better, I would think you're trying to trick me into giving some kind of prediction for the duck season.
We'll get to that question next.
Always dangerous ground. Well, there's kind of a lot of layers to that question. So maybe I'll back up a little bit and give you kind of thumbnail sketch kind of how I understand the kind of system works. Is that, the Central Valley, of course, supports the majority of our wintering waterfowl in the Pacific Flyway. I think about 60%. And so the number of birds reaching the Central Valley and how many birds reach the Central Valley all feed into that question. And the birds that reach the Central Valley, they really come through two major routes. They come through the Klamath Basin and they come through the Great Salt Lake. There are other routes that are smaller, but those are the two kind of main arteries that supply the Central Valley with wintering birds. So we almost need to step back and look what's happening in those two major arteries, if you will. As Jeff mentioned, essentially the Klamath Basin or the Klamath Basin refuges, the key refuges, are essentially dry. And in a normal year, they would be by far the most, well, not by far necessarily, but pretty close to the most important fall staging areas in the Flyway. And so essentially a lot of the birds entering the Central Valley would pause in the Klamath Basin for maybe up to a month, and then eventually they'd make their way south into the Central Valley. Same is true for the Great Salt Lake. Birds would stage in the Great Salt Lake in early fall and eventually migrate into the Central Valley. The problem this year is that we're probably likely to see accelerated migration through both of those landscapes simply because there's not going to be the food there that there normally is. That's going to be especially true in the Klamath Basin, less so in the Great Salt Lake, but certainly there's going to be much less wetland habitat in the Great Salt Lake than there normally is. So I think what we're going to see, Mike, is really accelerated migration through those two landscapes into the Central Valley. And of course, the Central Valley isn't necessarily well set up to handle kind of an early influx of birds. So from a food standpoint, we're likely to get earlier migration into the Central Valley. And our best guess right now is only about half the wetlands that would normally be flooded, say in October, early November, will in fact be flooded this year. And of, say, the 350,000 acres of winter flooded rice, we're only expecting around 80,000 of that to be flooded. So we have this kind of situation where we're getting birds into the Central Valley earlier than we otherwise might have. The food resources aren't there that typically are there. To what extent that's going to be a problem? I don't think it's necessarily going to be a great problem initially, because in a normal year, we have a pretty big food surplus in the Central Valley, really, that carries us through until about December. And then we begin to see that food surplus kind of disappear. So there's a bit of a cushion there. So what I expect is probably more birds in the Central Valley earlier otherwise, certainly less habitat, but I don't necessarily see a food shortage developing in fall or early winter. I see a bigger problem if, in fact, we don't get the winter rains that we need to essentially rejuvenate some of these habitats, get water into some of these wetlands or rice fields that normally would be wet but are now dry. So I don't necessarily see food issues early on. I see food issues developing if we don't get some later winter precipitation.
Now, yeah, Mark, there are a lot of layers to this, and I have about 1,000 questions running through my mind right now, so I have to slow it down and try to pick one. And I think what I'll do is I'll go to the most obvious. You said in a normal year you plan on or anticipate about 350,000 acres of winter flooded rice, and we're down to, you're projecting about 80,000 this year. What's the nature of that difference? Is it and some of this is going to relate to the water allocation and how it works. Is it a combination of lower rice production this year that may not have been able to occur because of limited irrigation water? Or is this simply a lack of water for that winter flooding aspect of it?
Well, to kind of put rice in context, Mike, so essentially winter flooded rice provides about half of all duck food resources in the Central Valley. And by winter flooded rice, I mean rice that is flooded after harvest. Some of that happens intentionally. Most of it happens intentionally. Some of it happens naturally, natural precipitation. The actual amount of planted rice this year went down about 25%, I think, probably from about 550,000 acres to about 400,000 acres. So certainly there's less rice out there to flood this year. But really the bigger effect probably is going to be the fact that we're just not going to get that winter flooding that we usually do. The surface water supplies that are traditionally used to flood those rice fields in October, November, December, they're just not there this year. And so that is really the culprit. Those surface water supplies that we usually use, that are usually available to winter flood those harvested rice fields.
Mark, one of the sort of logical questions that people are going to ask, and you may already be receiving it, is like, okay, what would we expect in terms of bird movements, bird distributions that may differ from normal? And so I guess I'll ask this maybe in a couple of ways. Number one, I find myself being curious, knowing that we've talked to some of our colleagues previously, Mike Katsadza being the notable person here, who was studying using radio telemetry birds, GPS marked birds, some of their movements in the Central Valley and up through Klamath, basically throughout the Pacific Flyway. I find myself curious if those studies are ongoing and if we're going to have any sample of marked birds to kind of see what the response is going to be. So that's one question. You can tell us what you know about that. And then the other would be to think about some of the other wetlands that exist there in California. And we've introduced these in some other podcast episodes with Renee Spence talking about some of our conservation efforts in the San Francisco Bay. I think we've talked about Sassoon Marsh before, and maybe some other locations farther down the coast. So there's that aspect of it too that we have to kind of keep in mind, that I'd like to think about. What do you envision? What do we know about the telemetry type studies? And then in terms of potential distributions into coastal areas?
Well, Mike, you're right. Mike Casazza at USGS and some collaborators at places like UC Davis have, over the past few years, really marked a large number of birds with satellite transmitters. And my understanding is, I think they have a life up to 2 years. And certainly in a situation like this year, if we're trying to understand how birds are reacting to drought conditions, the data provided by those birds is obviously very valuable. I've got to confess that I know Mike is no longer marking birds, and I'm not sure how many birds are still out there with live transmitters. I wish I could answer that question for you. I suspect I'm pretty sure there are some, and those that are still out there and transmitting a signal, they will provide some really, really interesting data about how birds are reacting to these drought conditions.
And then what do we expect might happen with regard to some of those other coastal habitats that I'm guessing they may not be as affected by drought? Would we maybe expect them to receive more use if, in fact, we don't get winter rains in the Central Valley and we might see some food shortages? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that's probably a pretty reasonable assumption. If in fact the Central Valley isn't rescued by some mid or late winter rains and conditions deteriorate there and more birds find their way into the valley, yes, I suspect that those coastal habitats in the vicinity, in essentially associated with San Francisco Bay and elsewhere, will become increasingly important as the winter progresses. And of course, Ducks Unlimited and its partners have done a tremendous amount of work improving those coastal habitats really over the last 20 years. So yes, I think that's probably the most reasonable prediction out there, that you'll see those coastal habitats really become important if in fact we don't get those winter rains in the Central Valley. The birds will begin to shift west into those coastal habitats.
Mark, I might think that those shifts could occur even before any type of midwinter food shortage. If we think about one of the things that you noted earlier, that maybe in a typical year we have 350,000 acres of winter flooded rice, and this year, at least at this time, we're only expecting 80,000. And let's kind of set the implications for food availability aside, but just think about the much smaller space available for those birds to distribute them. And this is kind of pure speculation, I guess, for that landscape on my part. But if we think about a kind of taking the same number of birds or a comparable number of birds and putting them into a wetland base that's that much smaller, you might think they would, we can kind of start thinking about what it's going to be like from the hunter perspective here. If you have water, you might have access to a lot more birds. And so the birds that are there, they might feel more pressure than they typically do. And perhaps that stimulates some of this move. I'm, like I said, wildly speculating here, but this at least serves as a useful transition to ask you what your thoughts are in terms of how what hunters can expect. And if the effects on hunters, their access to hunting locations would differ between some of the public areas, private areas, different types of habitats. For hunters that are listening to this, kind of talk to them and what might they expect in that regard.
Well, I suppose it depends, Mike, on where they are in the Pacific Flyway. Obviously, if you're a hunter that has maybe traditionally made the trek north up to the Klamath Basin to hunt this fall, my understanding is there will be no wetland hunting in those Klamath Basin, in Tule Lake and Lower Klamath National Wildlife Refuge this year. There may be some dry land hunting, but even then, I would encourage folks to kind of contact the refuge to find that out. So there's really not going to be any traditional hunting opportunities on those refuges, I think, this fall. A place like the Great Salt Lake, my understanding is, that there's about 160,000 acres of managed wetlands between state, federal, and private duck clubs. About 300,000 acres of unmanaged wetlands. My understanding is, talking to folks who actually, live and work in the vicinity of the Great Salt Lake, all those unmanaged wetlands are likely to be dry. So the hunting opportunities that they traditionally provide probably won't be there, which isn't surprising given that the lake is at kind of historic low levels. And my understanding is about a third of those managed wetlands, of those 160,000 acres of managed wetlands, will be dry too. So that'll obviously impact some hunting opportunities on public lands and hunting opportunities, perhaps maybe less so on private duck clubs. So when we look at those two areas, those are kind of different stories. The Central Valley, my guess is you're very correct in that, or I'm guessing you're correct in that, if you have water early, you're likely to have ducks. One, because the wetland or the rice footprint is going to be much smaller, at least earlier on, than it typically is. So birds are going to be compressed into far few acres of habitat, if you will. Maybe adding that a little bit, if we get some, accelerated migration through places like the Klamath Basin, that may be putting more birds at your doorstep earlier than otherwise would occur as well. Other parts of the Pacific Flyway, I think if you're a coastal hunter, you're probably not maybe greatly affected by this. You might even benefit it from some standpoint. Places like Eastern Washington, where you have a system where birds are essentially kind of roosting on the Columbia River or associated sloughs and then kind of dry field feeding. My guess is not a lot of change there either. Certainly the number of birds reaching you because of lower production might affect your hunting, but my guess is a lot of other things will remain the same unless we've seen a lot of crop failure in some of those areas. And I don't think that's necessarily true because I think a lot of those they're still able to irrigate some of those crops. So I think it's a mixed bag depending on where you are in the Pacific Flyway. And again, this will be colored too by the number of birds that ultimately reach you, and that will depend, on what's happened with some of these breeding populations.
Jeff, the other very important part of this conversation relates to Ducks Unlimited's conservation efforts and our response. I guess I would say our pre-existing long-term conservation efforts that we've been investing in for many years. Some of the water shortages and their effects, their challenges that they present to us in terms of effective wetland management are no stranger to us. We've been dealing with those for years. And so we're not necessarily caught flat-footed on what's happening. It's just the severity of it, the scale of it is a bit unusual. And that has prompted Ducks Unlimited and many others, understandably, to sort of accelerate and maybe enhance, amplify some of our conservation efforts or different aspects of our conservation efforts this year in response to that. So as the Director of Operations for the Western region, this is a natural question to you. Talk about our response to this, sort of in combination with and complementary to some of our other longstanding conservation efforts in these regions?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mike. I want to frame this in terms of multiple important components when we talk about those three kind of primary waterfowl areas: Klamath Basin, Great Salt Lake, Central Valley. These are areas that are there's a crowded landscape. There's a busy landscape. People play a predominant role in that landscape. And whether that's agriculture or whether that's municipal water supplies, both of those can apply in these landscapes. And water is essentially delivered. It comes through a pipe, it comes through a pump, it comes through a canal to the wetlands in each of these landscapes. And so when we talk about restoration, we can't restore, we can't tear the levees down on a river. We can't have these wetlands be functioning like they were historically before at least the settlement started happening and flood control started happening, because people are on the landscape and people are on the floodplain. So the wetlands, the birds don't know the difference because the wetland looks the same. We know the difference because people make a decision to turn a pump on or to open a canal gate and to flood water onto these wetlands. So that's an important component and important consideration of our conservation programs throughout the Western United States, is how do we provide functions and values to support these birds, to support the energetic needs of these birds. And it involves infrastructure. So we've always been working to improve the ability for managed wetlands to manage their water and control their water as most efficiently and effectively as possible. When water is abundant, that's not an issue. When water is scarce, that's a major concern, because you need every drop of that water to be used to its maximum potential for the birds. So our programs have always been focused on maximizing the effectiveness of water management on these habitats. And in fact, we've progressed to doing this on very large scale. For example, in the Central Valley, we've got the Gray Lodge Water Supply Project, which is essentially rebuilding the Biggs West Gridley irrigation system so that it can deliver all of the water that Gray Lodge is entitled to get. It does so in an effective way. It does so in an efficient way. And it also improves those same water deliveries and same benefits to agriculture along the canal, whether that's production agriculture in terms of orchards or winter flooded rice. In the Great Salt Lake, we've known for a while that what's important for the lake is how much water is in the lake. So we're trying to maximize the amount of water that can get to the Great Salt Lake. And there's a variety of different ways you can do this, through infrastructure improvements, through water banking, through dedication of water rights that are in stream flow or for wildlife beneficial use. So we've been working from a policy standpoint, from working on politics to improve the water situation to the Great Salt Lake. In the Klamath Basin, it's a mixture of what are the agricultural benefits for water going to a wildlife refuge? What are the fisheries benefits of water going to a wildlife refuge? And of course, what are the waterfowl benefits of waterfowl going to a wildlife refuge? And there we're navigating one of the most politically complex water situations perhaps in the United States, and certainly in the Western United States. And for there, we've launched a special initiative. So we've launched the Klamath Basin Initiative, which just was launched at the California State Convention just a few weeks ago. And this is a comprehensive approach to find some type of multi-beneficial solution for the wildlife refuges in the Klamath Basin, and doing so in such a way that both agriculture and endangered fish can benefit. In fact, our vision for the Klamath Basin is one in which the basin is capable of supporting thriving waterfowl populations, productive farmland, abundant fisheries, and the cultural values of each of these, because this is a landscape where people are present and they have their own cultural values. Waterfowlers, agriculture, farmers and ranchers, and tribal interests for the cultural values of salmon and suckerfish. So this Klamath Basin Initiative is working together with stakeholders to find these solutions that are collaborative, work on infrastructure improvements, because wetlands there use the same water infrastructure that agricultural does.
Jeff, I'm glad you mentioned partnerships, began to introduce those, and we are probably going to get much deeper into a discussion of some of the very specific partners that we work with in a couple of these different landscapes, the Central Valley and the Klamath Basin, on our subsequent episodes. But I want you to try to just emphasize the importance of those partnerships and the diversity of those partnerships, and maybe a good way to come at this is how those have perhaps changed through the years. We've always sought to work with partners, but it feels like, and you tell me if I'm wrong, but it certainly feels like increasingly, and certainly over the past 10 years, and I don't know if 10 years is the right milepost, but it feels like it to me, that we are increasingly recognizing the importance of diverse partnerships, solutions that deliver true mutually beneficial outcomes, and the situations unfolding in the Western U.S. and some of those landscapes you mentioned feels to me like a perfect example of that. Does that sound about right? The nature of the way we're viewing partnerships and their importance these days?
Oh, absolutely. It's Ducks Unlimited does nothing really without at least one other partner. It's a landowner at minimum. It's a funding partner. Sometimes we've got up to 12 different major funding sources that we have to be working with and collaborating with to get some of these projects done. And California is a special case, and I think our listeners would agree that it is in so many ways. And it's a challenge to work out here. It's the most regulated state in the country. It's the most populous state in the country. You can't walk outside without stepping on some kind of endangered species habitat. So trying to navigate that socio-political landscape for waterfowl, you have to rely on your partners to work with you to be successful. And that sometimes creates some interesting relationships. And we've always known that since the office was founded out here, is that for the most part, Californians are not going to be making decisions because of ducks alone. They're going to be making decisions for quote unquote wildlife or open space or water quality. And we take advantage of that because the beauty of a waterfowl project is that it inherently provides multiple benefits from at least a wildlife observation standpoint. But also wetlands are great for water quality. They're great for flood risk reduction. They're great for open space. And we take full advantage of the fact that Californians like to tax ourselves tremendously. And there's so much, and they also like conservation. So there's billions of dollars have been made available for the types of projects that waterfowl will benefit most from. And sometimes those funds come through the Water Quality Agency. Sometimes those funds come through public open space funding sources. But at the end of the day, we utilize these funds in from a variety of different partners, all for the benefit of wetlands and waterfowl. Most of the time, these areas in which we're doing work, they're huntable because they're on fish and game land, or Department of Fish and Wildlife land, or they're on U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There's duck club projects that we work on. But in some cases, that's not the case, because this is a rest area, or it's the bay itself, which may or may not be open because the cities have certain hunting restrictions out there. But the fact is that there are a variety of different funding sources that we can put together creatively that make sure waterfowl benefit from the work that we do. So partnerships are key. And going forward, the easy things are done. When the office first opened in the 90s, we had projects lined up left and right, and you couldn't do them all in a particular year. Now, the projects that are left are complicated, years-long projects, and you do those with a invested group of stakeholders and partners. Sometimes unique, but oftentimes there's a core group that we work together with. Fish and Wildlife Service, Department of Fish and Game are some of our strongest, most reliable partners that we work with.
Thank you for that summary, Jeff. And Mark, I want to come back to you here as we start to close this out. And I want to look forward a bit here to the waterfowl season. In terms of the way I want to ask this question is, so prospects for precipitation, for weather conditions that would, and salvage isn't necessarily the right word, but that would create a major turnaround in terms of wetland conditions for waterfowl. What can you tell us about the likelihood of that? When is the rainy season? What are some of the challenges of viewing that type of potential for a turnaround in the western landscape given the drought?
Well, again, I think it depends on where you're talking about, Mike. I think that window has closed for, say, the Klamath Basin, for the refuges in the Klamath Basin, or at least Tule Lake and Lower Klamath. I'm no expert on the Great Salt Lake, but a water body that big, I don't think is going to be affected at this point by significant rains in the short term. It's different, I think, in the Central Valley. In 2014, 2015, we found ourselves in very similar conditions as we are today in terms of the drought and its likely effects on waterfowl habitat. And we did start the season very dry. But we got significant rains in early January of 2015, which completely turned things around. A lot of those habitats, whether they were rice or wetlands, were essentially had water. In some cases, they were flooded. So the Central Valley is a place where significant late winter rains, which often happen, can really turn things around, and turn things around in a matter of days, frankly. But those other landscapes, the Klamath Basin, the Great Salt Lake, I think they respond to longer weather patterns or longer precipitation patterns. I don't think there's much that can help them in the short term here.
And Mark, is that also a function of a lot of the wetlands and waterfowl habitats out west primarily being sort of a managed variety? Is that also a difference from that landscape to the ones with which I'm more familiar?
I certainly think that's probably part of it, Mike. One of the things that makes the Pacific Flyway unique in many regards is our reliance on managed wetlands. That's not true everywhere in the Flyway, but when we look at some of these really important landscapes like the Central Valley or the Klamath Basin or the Great Salt Lake, managed wetlands are disproportionately important. And really, in no other Flyway do we see that kind of reliance on managed wetlands. And when you're relying on managed wetlands, that means in most cases you're relying on surface water deliveries, annual surface water deliveries. And that's a tricky thing in the West, because there is, as most people know, water supplies are not abundant in the West. And if you're relying on surface water deliveries, especially in drought conditions, that's a very tricky thing. And often that water doesn't materialize. In many cases, it's not materializing this year. So it's a real challenge, and it's certainly that reliance on managed wetlands on their surface water supplies is really heightened or really highlighted during the drought conditions that we're having now. It really kind of serves to illustrate that vulnerability, if you will. And so working to secure and maintain those surface water supply for those managed wetlands is really an important thing going forward, as is maintaining the quality, the infrastructure of those managed wetlands, because that's part of the equation too. But it is a challenge, and it does occupy a lot of what we do out here, both on the policy and the habitat delivery side of things.
So maybe one final question here. When we think about the implications of what we're seeing right now, short-term versus long-term effects, which one concerns you more? And when we think short-term, maybe we're thinking effects on waterfowl populations. But then long-term, when we think about what we are seeing this year as, heaven forbid, maybe an indication of things that are likely to occur more frequently. I hope that's not the case, but that's the nature of this question. What concerns you more, short-term or long-term in this regard, Jeff?
I think that the long-term is the most concerning. The amazing thing about waterfowl is they're highly resilient. And Ducks Unlimited has always said, we just have to make sure that the table is set when the birds arrive and they'll take care of themselves. And that's what we've been trying to do. We're still doing the same kinds of things that we've always needed to do, whether it's a flood year, whether it's a drought year. We're setting that table because waterfowl have, up to a dozen eggs sometimes. And if conditions are great, you're going to bring off 12 birds that year. That's going to just really help the population rebound. So that's a short term, and I'm not concerned about that. What I'm really concerned about is what Mark just said about the nature of wetlands within the Pacific Flyway. Somebody makes a decision on whether to put water there, whether it's turning on a pump or opening a canal gate or releasing water from a dam. We're dependent upon human decisions to supply waterfowl habitat. And that includes rice fields. Is that farmer making an economic decision to pay for the water to put it out on a rice field? Or are they making an economic decision to pay for the diesel fuel to disc that rice straw stubble into the ground to achieve the same thing? Get rid of the rice straw so they can plant again. However, one is much more beneficial for waterfowl than the other, and that's winter flooding. So I'm concerned about how decisions will be made as a result of this drought going forward, and will those decisions be beneficial or will they be detrimental to supporting waterfowl?
Well, thank you for that, Jeff. And I look forward to the days when conditions improve out west. This is 2021 is turning out to be a pretty tough year across the board in the central and western U.S. The one thing I am thankful for, however, is that we have folks like you and Mark and your entire staff that are out there that wake up every day and think about these things and have been in the trenches for many years and will hopefully continue to be so, fighting the good fight and representing ducks and wetlands at the table where all these decisions are made. We certainly need that. And similar thanks to all of our partners that work alongside us in that regard. Jeff and Mark, thank you so much for joining us here and sharing your time, and I look forward to catching up with you again on a future episode of the Ducks Unlimited podcast.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
A special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Jeff McCreary, Director of Operations for Ducks Unlimited Western Region, and Dr. Mark Petrie, Director of Conservation Planning for our Western Region. We greatly appreciate their time and sharing it with us here. As always, we thank our producer, Clay Baird, for getting these podcasts edited and out to you. And then to you, the listener, we thank you for your time and we thank you for your support of wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.